Well, good afternoon and welcome to Outgrowing Content Types. We're here to talk about Drupal entities, those in core, some in contrib modules, and the benefits of building your own. And I hope you leave this session with an understanding of the work and risks involved with creating your own custom entities, but also feel empowered to roll them into your own apps. My name is Jim Vomero, and I'm a senior engineer at Four Kitchens. I have over 10 years experience in Drupal, and I use the framework for all my nerdy hobbies, from running calculations for brewing beer, to planning retro arcade projects, to teaching kids to learn to prepare for the zombie apocalypse at Philly summer camps. If you have any questions after this presentation, please reach out. I'm always excited to talk shop and would love to keep this conversation going. I'm a web chef at Four Kitchens, and we build websites and apps for organizations that depend on large-scale or unconventional content. We work with associations, publishers, enterprise organizations, in media, and in higher education, and we make big websites. Now, my first big question to answer is, what is an entity? And honestly, I change my answer based on who I'm talking to. So for this session, it's for technical decision makers, but programming experience is not required. So by just show of hands, who here regularly works in back-end development with PHP, MySQL, maybe Drupal APIs? Okay, and who would say they regularly work on site building, views, content types, architectures in the Drupal UI? Large part of the room. Finally, who's here just doesn't identify as a programmer at all? That's okay. Cool. So this session is largely about the business needs that may require custom entities, and we're going to look at tools to build them, but an actual training on how to build custom entities could easily fill an all-day workshop. So hopefully by the end we'll have a taste of it. To answer that question, what is an entity, it helps to look at Drupal's history. And it seems like in this room I can get a little nerdy, so I will. In Drupal 6, that was the first version where we had this database abstraction layer. And with that, the storage mechanisms organized Drupal's content hierarchy in a very mature way. Drupal 6 could often include hundreds of modules, but one of the most beloved was CCK, the Content Construction Kit. And this allowed you to add fields to a content type. Unlike a lot of the competing CMSs, CCK extended content storage in a thoughtful and meaningful way. This is why I usually pick Drupal for any given project. This whole idea of having fieldable content was pushing us towards making everything a node. So our public content, like our pages, our blog posts, our news stories, those were nodes. The user profiles, they were definitely nodes. The media assets, images, videos, were often created as content types. And this created a lot of confusing problems. It was node abuse. And it became clear that Drupal needed to rethink its content model. So in Drupal 7, they tried to clean up this mess and did a great job creating a generic class for storing data. Now, not everything needs to be a node. We start talking about entities. And this is an internal and intentionally abstract term. It's rather generic. So an entity, and I saw this in the documentation, in Drupal are objects that are used for persistent storage of content and configuration items. In D7, this was nodes, taxonomy, comments. All of these things became natively fieldable. Ooh, that's a tongue twister. And the ability to build these types to fit your organization was a driving reason to use this CMS. Now in Drupal 8, entities are specifically typed objects. Content tools like the content entity interface, entity change interface, entity owner interface, revision log interface, entity publish interface, among many others exist. And these are common interfaces for allowing us to interact with content in a consistent way. Now, not all content needs to be revisionable or translatable or track publishing details, but these features exist if you want to use them. It's also important to notice there are two types of entities in Drupal 8. And that is content and configuration entities. I'm going to focus on content entities in this presentation, but they're actually both relevant to this conversation. Starting off in core and contrib modules, honestly, the core entity types are powerful enough to build almost any complicated Drupal site I work on. And the object-oriented architecture of Drupal 8 allows us to easily customize them and let them fit our needs. Most of my Drupal projects can be used just with a handful of core and contrib modules. So some of the common ones. Content types. This is the node module. These are traditionally for your top-level content pages. Users define and configure access accounts. Files and media store multimedia and associated metadata. Oh, this is also a good time to introduce the word bundle. So Bundle, which are flexible versions of an entity. So users, for example, don't have bundles. A user is a user. If you add a field to the user entity, all users have that field. But nodes are bundleable. The bundles are called content types. Every node has certain properties, so a title, an author, a created date, a promoted field, but they can also have their own fields, and each content type can have unique properties on top of the base settings. So I'm going to throw the word bundle around a little bit. There's also some popular contribs that I use on most sites I work on, and I encourage you to check these out if you're new to Drupal. Paragraph is our main tool for mapping data to our design components, and there's a lot of other neat projects coming in as the layout tools mature. Web forms is an interesting one because it actually defines 3 entities. So the web forms, the web form options, and then the submissions. Each one has unique storage and configuration needs. And groups is another one I find a lot of interest at looking at under the hood. It defines a collection of content, and the collection itself is one type of entity, and then references between content and the collection is another type of entity. I encourage looking at these because it's a great way to learn how the entity API works. You're going to be able to look at the source, look at the annotation, and start to understand what makes each one tick. In between those core and contrib modules, we have a lot of tools at our disposal, and Drupal 8 makes it easy to extend those. So why would you even want to build a custom entity? That's the kind of core of the presentation today. Usually it's not out of necessity. We can customize nodes, users, paragraphs to fit our purposes. But we still have some solid reasons to make custom entities. So I prepared 8 examples of why you might want to create a custom entity. And in practice, you probably want multiple of these reasons to exist before you go down that route. Reason number 1, custom entities can reduce overhead. This is my go-to case. When a node is just too big. So consider this story as a publisher. I would like to add reusable callouts and cards to ancillary content areas. I have 3 examples on my slides, and each one looks a little different. One has a button, one has a link, and one, the entire card itself is a link. They're also very similar. They each have an image. They each have a link field, I presume, on the back end, and 1 or more text fields. And depending on your architecture, paragraphs could definitely be used in this case. But let's make the assumption that I want a reusable component library. I want all these ancillary items to exist in some specifically managed place, and I can add them to the pages as needed. I could create these as content types, and I have in the past. So maybe there's a person spotlight content type, an infographic content type, and a banner content type. And if we create these as content types, they all of a sudden get all of the features of a node. So they have a public URL, maybe default search and indexing rules, metadata rules, content workflow, all the base fields that may not matter to us. We don't want these to display outside of the context of where they should be shown, or it probably falls apart. You wouldn't look at the node page just for one of these on its own. So in the end, while a node works, there might be a better way to create this ancillary content type as an entity. There are projects that can help, too. If you were to make this a node, the Rabbit Hole project is great. But for me, I want to explore what happens if this becomes its own entity. And I have more of it on the next slide. Building it as a custom entity allows us to define it first and define it the way we want it, rather than to build a node and then remove all the features that we didn't want. So another example of the node being too big is my hobby of brewing beer. I use a Raspberry Pi to take temperature readings of my fermenting beer. And a JSON feed delivers data once every minute, and each data point has a timestamp, a temperature reading, and a recipe it's being tracked to. Now, if I wanted to store all this in Drupal, and I did because I'm a nerd, I could put this in a custom table. But then I'm not even using Drupal. That's just me knowing how databases work. I want to leverage the features of the CMS. So I could make a temperature reading node, content type just for that with those 3 fields. This is complete overkill. It's actually a better example of the last one with the ancillary content. Because for these temperature readings coming in on a data feed, I don't need an add form or an edit form or a delete form. I don't need revisioning, unique access roles per user. I'm only interested in storing this data as Drupal sees fit and being able to use it in things like views. So creating a custom entity allows me to find a very simple data model, and I can leave all of the other content fields that come with nodes out of the way just to find what I need. Reason number 2, this is kind of the opposite. What happens when content types, nodes, are just too small for what I have in store for them? So in this example, I want you to consider a nonprofit, and it has regional offices, and each office is going to have a microsite. So one location would have a contact page, a staff directory, and a mission statement, and maybe some links back to the local community. The location is also going to have a list of services, but each office might provide different services, so that definitely makes them unique. And some locations are real go-getters. They want a blog just for them, so they're going to promise to maintain that blog. We could create this sort of association of content as a microsite using content types. Maybe using the groups module to say certain content types can be a member of it, and creating rules where you can only add one location page per group, or creating validations where as you're saving menu items, you assure that the About Us always flows to the top of the menu hierarchy. This gets complicated quick. It demands a lot of custom rules on how nodes work. Nodes are usually pretty flexible, and it becomes a challenge to enforce rules where the menu always exists a certain way, or only certain links are allowed in certain orders, or conditionally display based on a setting for that regional office. So this is an example of, I think, a great place where we can use a custom entity to create this microsite. Everything then will be stored or referenced through this single entity, and we have the ability to write our business logic in just one place. There's no need to override how nodes work. We don't need to create custom rules for the metadata, URL aliases, permissions. We define it actually in the entity handlers themselves, the permission handler, the storage handler, and I'll show you some examples of it at the end of this slide deck. I most recently used this structure on a university website. It was for a degree entity type, and the degree had lots of subpages: tuition, faculty, application, contact information, courses. All of these subpages existed in a particular order, but not every degree had the same subpages. This was a great use case for entities because I didn't need to strong arm the rules of a node to get them to fit a certain way. I could just program them into the entity once. And everything followed the same business logic. It means that every degree on the university website has a consistent look and presentation, and sort of an expectation of how it's going to be laid out. Reason number 3 for creating a custom entity is customizing the presentation of entity data in forms. So I mentioned I run summer camps in the Philadelphia area as a just side fun business. And my summer staff submit their cards online. So time cards, they have a lot of fields, and not all of them are tracked in the same way. Let me tell you about the workflow a little bit. Our camp counselors submit their hours and their mileage after working an event. So they have an add form where there's a number of fields. After submitting your time card, our camp director gets an email to approve those hours. Our camp director cannot edit somebody else's working hours. Only the employee can edit their own hours. But they are the only ones that can set the pay rate and sometimes change the pay rate if, say, there was some reimbursement for that week, or mileage was given at a different rate. After the camp director approves our hours, the timesheet goes to a pending queue, and our finance team gets the time card, and they can only sign off if the employee was paid or not. So they're allowed to make corrections to the camp counselor's work, not allowed to change the hours that were originally submitted, and any of the changes along the way are logged to a transaction log. Since I made this as a custom entity, I was able to take full control over these forms and apply rules like which fields are editable when by who, and ensure that it was always consistently applied. In fact, in this example, I've made it that you can never, ever, ever delete a time card entity, which is not something I've ever done with nodes. But for me, it was about having viable financial data going forward. So we've made a content type or an entity type that you just can't delete because that was a business logic, and it worked well for our situation. Number 4 is kind of related, and it's allowing unique access control to permissions, or access control and permissions. And a few years ago, I created a ticketing system for a support team. The tickets came in a lot of different ways. So someone could submit a ticket online, they could walk up to the help desk or call the help desk. They could file a work order, and it got mailed down through some external channel. And the tickets might get expedited. So the help desk staff is going to put them in that bucket. Is it IT support, an equipment request, a training? And they went out to very different parts of the organization. The workflow here was complicated and dynamic. So a user, probably a customer who logged in through the SSO, would create a ticket, and they'd see some of the fields. The help desk staff could then ask questions and assign that ticket to the correct department. And then when you're in a department, that team member can edit some of the fields, not all of them, and they can leave comments. If a ticket's not in your department, you can comment on it, but you can't edit it. Once the ticket's resolved, you can no longer edit those fields without reopening it. A manager had to reopen it. There was also a business team that would want to just pull reports of tickets, so they had view access, but no other type of editorial access. And what this was not just field permissions, but field permissions that depended on your role and the state of the ticket. And this was a level of complexity that could be a challenge with nodes. By creating custom entities, we had one access control handler, and we could read it top down, see the methods that were being called, and we had full control over the workflow. So I think it was a solid use case for a custom entity. It allowed us to build up access controls from the ground up and really take control of our workflow. Reason number 5. This one usually hits home because so many folks in this room have worked on a conference website at some point. And so this is reusing content definitions through bundles. And in my example here, I have 5 different types of activities that may happen at a conference. So a session, a keynote, a workshop, a social, bird of a feather. And these activities are very similar. They have a title, a location, a time slot. And there's some things that are unique. So the keynote might have some extra marketing collateral, so they have a banner image. And the social and the workshop, they take registration, so there's a link for those. The birds of the feather, they're made on the fly, so there might not be an image, and that's okay. They're treated in a very different way. Some of the fields are unique, but some of them span every bundle. I've made this with nodes years ago, and it works. There's no reason you can't create a different content type for each one of these. The challenge is, as soon as you want to add one more of these, or you want to start maintaining these, in that each one of these now exists as its own bundle. So if I wanted to create one more entity type, and I wanted all 4 of those fields, I just have to go through that exercise of clicking, adding the field, adding the next field, adding the third field, adding the fourth field. By creating these as our own conference activity entity, we're able to say that these top 4 fields are just base fields. They exist for every single one of them every time. When you create a new activity, those 4 fields exist. Not only do they exist, but they're presented in the same way, they go through the same validation. And so I can have things like validation on a title field that does not affect my other content types because it's in this custom entity. It's allowed us to take all of the presentation logic for a conference activity and store it in a meaningful way just for that entity without messing with our other content type logic. So our web forms and our pages and the few other things that are on our site can continue to exist. We didn't have to get under the hood. We just defined the logic we need in our custom entity. We didn't have to worry about turning off anything that node would do. I keep picking on nodes, but I suppose we could abuse any of the existing entities if we push them too far. Reason number 6, when performance is a high-valued goal. And we were talking about this a little before the session started, that I take for granted that Drupal is going to do a lot of the work for me. When I create a new content type, there's going to be some records of those nodes in the node table and the node field data table. The revision, let's assume it's revisionable, as nodes are going to be, at least for me. There's going to be a revision table and a node field revision table, so the active data and then a history of the data through all of its different revisions. And in this case, we're creating a content type that stores weather information. So it's the day's high temperature, the day's low temperature, and it looks like the time it was recorded. Each one of these is a field, and so the field has its field definition and its revision field. So just this one content type with 3 fields. I have on the screen 10 different tables in the database, but truthfully there's going to be more. One probably for the user ID that you might have to join on. In the end, even a simple content type has a lot of tables. If you're working on a system where performance matters, there's some other things we could leverage by creating our own custom entities. And there's my refined model. So using the entity API, we have full control over our storage model. And we can denormalize this example so that the data appears in a single custom table. This can let you enhance query performance, make a database more convenient to manage, and facilitate the acceleration of reporting. And I would love to benchmark this to see what this actually means, but this is a classic programming example of normalized versus denormalized databases. So feel free to check out that topic. It has nothing to do with Drupal, other than you have the ability to take over ownership of how your data is stored. So if this is important to you, the mechanism's there with custom entities. And my last business case is using non-standard storage for modeled data. Now, nearly all entities in Drupal core, content entities, exist with SQL storage. There's a handful that use like a no storage interface. But at its core, Drupal 8 is built in a platform or a database agnostic way. It shouldn't matter for Drupal anymore if the data is coming from an internal database, external database, a JSON feed, some other system, as long as the data is stored somewhere consistently. And there is a Drupal project called External Entities. I'm just including on this slide because I've never had to do this, but it is a neat concept if you ever have to. So the External Entities module allows you to connect data sets from external databases and use it as if it was natively in your site. And while the content lives external, you can run views against it and do all of your normal content interfaces as if it was native. I just haven't had a reason to try it yet, and I think this image is related to someone importing data from Wikipedia. I'm not sure. Pull it from the project page. So with that, I powered through because there's a lot to talk about, and I want to show some examples or how you can get started. I'm curious if you're excited, if you're feeling empowered, and if you're ready to create some custom entities. I see one hand, that's awesome. Which case, I gotta say, there's some danger in all of this. So let's do the sobering reminder here. There's a lot of reasons not to take this on. Number one, there is a steeper learning curve to this than other Drupal APIs. There is documentation, but it is either underdocumented or documented using very internal jargon. So you might learn more through examples and cracking open those contrib modules I had on the slides earlier as a way of learning it rather than looking for a tutorial online. Number two, it's less likely that contrib modules will work with your custom entities. And this was something that scared me maybe 3 years ago, not so much nowadays. So when Drupal 8 first came out, there was a node clone module, and there was an automatic node title module, and there were a lot of modules that had the word node in it. And what that meant is if you had a custom entity, that module probably wasn't going to do anything for you. But now we're in a much healthier space. A lot of these modules are built with entities in mind. It's a little more abstract. It is still a risk you're taking on, so keep it in mind. If you build a custom entity, your contrib modules that you're downloading may not have been built with you in mind, but you know they're going to work for nodes. Custom entities may not inherit future Drupal features. This is certainly related. When I was making a Drupal entity, I want to say between 8.4 and 8.5, or maybe 8.3 and 8.4, there were some changes to the publishing interface, and I didn't know about it. And so while everything was backwards compatible, my content was missing out on some wonderful new features because I wasn't building off of nodes. I went rogue, did my own thing, and I now need to be responsible for maintaining that code, which brings us to number 4. You're responsible for any of the potential technical debt that might come from this. So those are words of warning, but hopefully I didn't scare you away. They're a lot of fun to play around with, and once you feel confident, they're 100% safe to use in production environments. In fact, most of those modules I had custom entities in them. So I have 2 ways I want to show off custom entities. The first is for the site builders, which there's quite a lot in this room. This is building custom entities using a point-and-click user interface. And there is maybe a little star on that. There's actually a lot you can do under the hood with those as well. And that's the ECK Entity Construction Kit module. And the second is generating entities with Drupal console. This is a command line tool that I absolutely love, and we'll give it a shot. Okay, so this is a vanilla Drupal site.
You want to press record?
He just did.
Oh, it's recording.
Sorry, I didn't see you. That was fast.
I'm quick. So this is a vanilla Drupal 8 site. I have downloaded a few modules just to make my life easier. So I've enabled the admin toolbar, and we have downloaded and enabled the ECK module. It's enabled like any other module I included with Composer and just turned it on. But that is it. And so I think this room has a lot of power users in it. It shouldn't be anything shocking to say if I went to structure, content types, we're going to see a list of content types. This is made with the node module, and these are the bundles of the node module. There's an article and a page. We can create more. It has some base properties, but add fields as you go.
Could you make your screen a little larger?
Great point. Thank you for that. The new field that we're here in the instruction menu is the ECK entity types, and there's nothing in here right now. So this is where we can define a new type of entity. And for me, I like to annoy my family and friends with bad jokes. So let's make a new entity type called a joke. And it asks you if you want these base fields on. These are something you may come to expect when you create a new node, but it's kind of proof that we don't need it. We might not need to store the author or a title. Maybe the joke just exists. It just is. I know, a little deep for late in the day. So I'm not going to add any of these fields, but if you were to use it, it means that all bundles of your custom entity do get this field associated with it. So let's create a new joke, entity type. And voila, as soon as it's done spinning, we have a new entity type. It's called a joke, and it does absolutely nothing yet. So the next thing we're going to want to do is for this, it's going to assume that all of your entities have a bundle type with it. Maybe there's just one bundle or multiple, but they're all structured that you could have multiple bundles. So we talked about bundles before. Let's create some. And one is going to be called a knock knock. It is a flavor of jokes. It's going to have a certain set of fields, right? A maybe call response pattern. And we'll just save that. And now we have a bundle called knock knock. This is analogous to your content types. So our joke types versus our content types. Add another one, and we'll call it a pun. Those are the ones that really annoy my family and friends and coworkers. And now we have two entity types. What's happening with the ECK module is it is making some pretty safe assumptions on what you need in your data model. And so when I reviewed those 7 reasons to create a custom entity, they may not apply here, at least what I'm doing out of the box. It has made assumptions on how you want your data stored. It's doing all those database tables we showed. It's making assumptions on how this interacts with other parts of your system, permissions-wise. It's generating permissions for you. This is a nice way to create an entity that's separate from your nodes, your taxonomies, your users, and to give it custom permissions, custom overrides, but they are still overrides. If you want to make this thing, this joke now do something special, we might end up writing some custom code for it to undo the assumptions ECK has made on our behalf. I will also say, and I kind of mentioned this before, there is another layer to the ECK project where they're putting a lot of work into developer tools, hooks, and events where you could further customize how these work in a very standardized way. You don't have to get too dirty in the code to learn how to start customizing these to fit your needs. Question?
Do you have to define at least one bundle?
I believe so. I always have, so I've never tried not to. The definition of an entity when it has bundles versus not is not insignificant. So my guess is that under the hood, ECK just determined everything has bundles, and if you only have one instance, then that's fine as far as your storage goes.
Okay.
That is the situation where the bundle itself is a configuration entity, and so it has a whole other set of definitions.
You said this before, but can an entity have more than one bundle of its own?
Yep, I think so. I think if I understand, can an entity have more than one bundle of its own? Yes, so it is, once an entity exists, you're going to determine if it has bundles or not. I believe in ECK, we're just always going to assume there are bundles, but each one of these bundles could have as many fields as you'd like, and it's abstract that you can just keep making them the way you normally would. I hope that helps. My apologies if I misinterpreted it. So let's try Drupal console, and this is my bad camp generic site. We use Lando, and I created a module called beer. Actually, let me just show it to you, and I will zoom in a minute once we create this. But the only thing in our beer module is an info file, and I love homebrew, so being in the Bay Area is exciting. Get to try all the fun stuff. I want to create a content type where I can, put my tasting notes in it. And so I have a blank module. All it is an info.yaml file. And we're going to create a new entity. So we use Lando, so ignore that prefix if that means nothing to you. And command is Drupal generate entity content. We could go configuration. There's a few commands in this space. And it's going to walk you through. For the sake of time, I'm going to say no to a lot of the questions. But honestly, I learned about custom entities by creating these, seeing what Drupal console generated, and then destroying it, and then changing one answer, and seeing what it generated, and destroying it. And it taught me a lot about the structure of how entities really work under the hood. Module name, I think I called it beer. Yes, I did. Standard class, we're going to call this we'll call it a beer entity. And enter machine name, sure. I could just call it beer, but New label, we'll just call the label of a beer and say like add new beer. Base path, I wanted it in the admin structure menu. All of these things, with the exception of bundle, are super easy to change. Does this have bundles? I'm going to say no. I can certainly think of cases where I might want to have homebrew versus commercial brew, and they would have different fields. Is it translatable? I will often say yes. This is another one that is not easy to change later, in my opinion. But for the sake of this demo, I will say no, because it's going to make it that much harder to look at in our examples. And let's keep that text as big as possible. Is it revisionable? Not for me. This is just logging one thing. Will it have forms? Yes, it will. The add, the edit form, the delete form, all of those. Will it have an owner? Sure. That's the person who submitted it. Do we want to have per bundle permissions? This one doesn't have bundles, but it does have similar levels of permissions. So experiment with these and see what it changes. I'll just say yes for now. We can look at the permissions it generated. And that's it for our wizard. There's 839 lines of code generated across 16 files. Let's look at a few of them and get a sense. In fact, there's one in particular. A lot of these you can delete. It gave you sensible starter code. This is boilerplate for creating a custom entity. I can turn this module on right now. Actually, let's do it. Module install beer. And this entity will exist. But a lot of these things I might decide is overkill. A lot of them actually are pretty blank, or they say just call through the parent. So for storage, just store it like all the other nodes and users and things like that, unless you want to do something special. What this module has done is given you a place to store that code if you want to start overriding it without affecting your other entity types. Let's look at what it generated. All right, I will do my best to zoom in and such, and it looks like the projector is clipping away a little bit. So the most important file for us to go through right now is the beer entity, and this is in our module /src/entity/ the name of our entity, which is beer entity is our class. If you're unfamiliar with the annotation system, these are definitions that are associated with this entity. While it is existing in a comment, these are actionable, these are functional, so don't take this lightly. And understanding what these keys are, they're well documented online, but we'll look at a few examples right here and now. Once again, it created some sensible defaults for us. And just for an example, the view builder, this is when you're looking at content. View, manage, view one, view multiple. It is just using the default Drupal core view builder. If you wanted to create your own, you could inherit from this or copy this file and write your own. Use it for inspiration. But some it decided it did want to do different. The views data. This is another handler. This is for how does the data for your custom entity work in Drupal's views, if you have views enabled on your site. And let's look at that file. This is a good one to pick on because literally the only thing it does is say, well, do all the views that the parent entity types would, like any other entity. And now here's this place where you can write your own. So Drupal console, wonderful tool for getting you started in this space. There's lots of comments to walk you through it. And actually, the one I want to look at, since we do have a few extra minutes here, is Node, since it is one that so many of us are familiar with. So this is the Node entity that's so well loved. It has an ID of Node. It has a label of content. That's kind of an evolution. We say add a new content item if you're talking about it in the singular. If you're talking about the bundles, you're talking about a content type. All of these keys you can use in defining your custom entities. The handlers are another one where you can really learn what's going on and decide if you want to use the way Node does it or roll your own. So storage is how the fields are going to be stored in Drupal, the properties and content field UI fields. Let's find some ones. Fun ones. Access. So here is your Node access handler, and it's going to have two methods of particular interest. Access, which says, can I view this? And create access, which is, can I create one of these nodes? In this case, there's bundles, so you'll see some of that language here. But it's fairly obvious if you've worked on Drupal's checkboxes with permissions before. One of the first things it says, do you have permissions to bypass node access? And if so, you'll probably be able to see the node. Do you have permissions to access content? If you don't have that, you probably can't see this node. and it goes through the different layers of it. If I were to create a custom content type that needed custom permissions, I may end up interfering with this logic to redo it versus in my beer entity, where I have, I assume, I thought there was an access one in here. I can add my own. So this is a case. Oh, is it on there?
Yeah, it's right above base table.
Right above base table. Perfect. There it is. So it came with its own access handler, and this is where you can decide what is the access levels for your custom entity. So it's using CRUD operations for the most part in its access control handlers, and it's saying, are you going to view it? And let's go through the cases. Is the thing published? Do you have the permission to view unpublished if it's not? Are you updating it? Do you have the permission to edit beer entities? Because I'm, changing my log. What's nice is it gave you sensible defaults, but you go nuts. This is your entity. You own it. It's also a nice way to learn Drupal. A couple other ones that are neat. Entity keys. This is important if you're the type that's working in a database. And there's a few others that are important here. Beer entity. So if you were going to add fields to your entity, those instances of the fields are unique. If I were to add a date field to a node, and a date field to a user, and a date field to my beer, those actually have completely different settings, and they are prefixed in the database with this base table name. A lot of things are going to programmatically come from the keys that you set in here. Is translatable true or false? Do you have bundles by permission, or permissions by bundle? What is the admin permission? There's some of these that are just magical. So it's saying, I expect there to be a checkbox that says administer beer entities, and it's going to let you start superseding things. So little shortcuts of things that you're probably doing anyways in your entities. If you didn't want it, it is quite possible to delete almost everything in these declarations, and it will still work. You just don't inherit the things that Drupal will give you free out of the box if you want those features. Some of them are super magical. Field UI base route. This is when you're looking at an entity type definition, and you want those add field or manage form, manage display, manage fields. I don't know if I got them all right. That is, what is the route of that page? So here it is. It exists there, beer entity.settings. Another one of the files in this generated list of modules is going to have that form defined. Since I am running out of time, let me, do I still have, oh, there it is. Jump to the end. I don't remember if I had it. Nope. So I am running out of time. I will take some questions, but I want to thank you all for coming to this session. I hope that you find a use case for using these custom entities. They actually are very easy to get your hands dirty. The ECK module got your back, but as soon as you're feeling a little more adventurous, Drupal console is a great learning tool. These business cases are no joke. I have found my websites using custom entities be more maintainable, more performative, and just all around allowed us to map business logic to Drupal without having to fight it every step of the way. So thank you again for coming. I have cards up here so we can keep this conversation going, or we'll hang out tonight. Plus, I left some time for questions because that's super important. So are there any? Yes?
You got a super simple model. What about using the data module for just like a table that you can do views on?
Since Drupal will let you, I think there's nothing wrong with that, and I would encourage it. I've never tried it. Have you had some experience in there?
Yes.
How'd it go?
So far, so good. But I feel like I'm not leveraging enough of Drupal. But it works pretty good.
And I'll repeat it back for the recording and using you found some success in using the data module for custom storage.
Yes.
That's awesome to hear. Yes, sir.
How hard is it to integrate your custom entity bundles with views, or does views already handle it because it's already supporting entities?
Very easy. So by default, let's see if I still have it open here. This custom entity did have a views data handler, and
So it already knows how to pick it up.
it's just giving us what entities did out of the box. Let's check out this parent. It's going to look at things like, and I'm seeing if any of them have very familiar names. It's going to look at every field and just expose it to views. It's going to create operation links, so an edit link, a delete link. A lot of the things that you've come to expect to exist are going to exist for your custom entity. It's going to create the different joins, sorting mechanisms for each one of your fields.
This would probably have to be rewritten, though, if your data source is not the standard Drupal data model.
For sure. And with some exceptions. So if you are using these interfaces, no, you're fine. So there are some interfaces that will help protect you and make sure that you have something that is abstract enough that it should work. There are so many entities that can use views that don't even use the same types of storage. I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of a really good example, but there are entities that store things in flat files and such, or don't have storage, and views still work. So I know it's very possible, and I know that views even creates some very platform agnostic queries. Like if you ever use Solar Search, those queries are extremely different, but Vue still integrates very nicely. Yet you may be on your own, and then likewise, I don't know how to get back. You may decide that you don't want any of those fields, and you can delete this and create your own, or just expand. If you have some calculated fields that you want to add to your view, you can add them right here. Question?
Yeah. What if I made some assumption about my entity and I said, oh, all of these entities are going to have these 4 things or 5 things or whatever, and then I later find out that I made a boo-boo, and I've already actually put content now into my database as entities. Is there a way out or a way to fix that to kind of...
So yes, in your exact example, you're talking about how do we take a step back if we've made some assumptions that were wrong, build a custom entity, and in this case you were talking about a base field maybe. A field that you want to exist for all bundles, and later on you say, oh, that wasn't right, or maybe it wasn't the right type. You created a string field, and it's like, oh, that should have been an int. And it would just be better if my life was an int. So it is not as easy as you would like it to be, because Drupal's trying to protect you from yourself. And when it sees configuration that mismatches, it will bark. There was a time recently where Drupal would try to do some schema updates. But now, if you want to start messing with things like base fields, where data already exists, you are probably going to write an update hook. You're going to change your schema definition locally. And you'll probably have to change, in this case, I'll show you where it is at.
I think I already know where you're going, because I think I ran into this once before.
Here is our base field definition. So in this case, we said every one of these beer logs is going to have a user ID, everyone's going to have a name, everyone's going to have a status. Drupal will use these to describe your data, but this does not actively manage your data once it exists in the database. So you have to change it here, change it in the database, and anywhere else that schema definition exists. It is more manual, but it was for everyone's protection. It is as big of a pain with custom entities as it would be with the core entities. Yes?
And is it the same thing for the opposite problem when you find out later that you want another base field added?
Nope. Super simple to add things. So once again, Drupal wants you to tell it to change things. There was a time where it was a little more automated, but I believe in 8.7 they started to restrict that a little bit more. And so I would create a new base field here, and I would probably have an update hook. And I'm trying to think if this has a schema definition with it. I don't have the files handy. Oh, actually, we can look at the output. So there is not a schema definition here, but certainly you're going to end up writing an update to tell that the schema changed.
Would it be a viable strategy to export your data, delete the whole entity, recreate it, and then migrate it back in?
So in the case where you got to change a schema, would you want to export and re-import it? I've certainly done that on a per field basis, where say something was given as a program code. It's always going to be 2 characters, I promise. And then it ends up being a 5-character digit because the software changed. I've certainly done that, where I've just had the 2 fields exist simultaneously. And even in the case of a custom entity, what's nice is you could create maybe some business logic where there should be a form here. Beer entity, let's see, Drupal source. I was hoping there would be one that said forms. Anyone see it? Oh, there it is. So in this case, we are logging it, and We could, actually, just calling through the parent. We could alter these forms that say, if there exists data in here, in the old one, display it. And display the new field. Or you can write a custom migration to map it all to the new field. But at least since this is your own form, you could start to add that kind of business logic in there and say, you know, there's going to be two form fields while this exists in definition. Also, just in case, let's say you had those two fields exist. So as you see in these base entities, they each have a key. There's a user, there's a name. Because we made our own ID, we had to make methods, and Drupal console got our back. So it has a method called getOwner. And in this case, it's just saying, go find that user field. If this user field changed, or if there was multiple, I can put the logic right in here and redefine this method. It's one of the nice things about being object-oriented is we can plan for the future. And so it might be get new user ID if it's set, and if not, get the old user ID if you're in a case of transition. So I'm not in the habit of deleting things if I don't have to. That seems like a bigger liability. But yes, messing with schemas is always a touchy subject, regardless if you have custom entities. Any other questions? Yes?
What shell are you using?
This is Zeesh, ZSH?
Do you know what theme it is?
I'll have to look that one up.
Yeah, some of your things are custom.
Yeah, when I'm not presenting, I'll find out which shell that is.
Looks nice.
Thanks. Well, thank you so much. I would love to chat with everybody. I'm also presenting tomorrow on editorial interfaces, so feel free to stop by and hope to see you around the conference.